Good evening. And thank you, Lisa, for the longest introduction I've ever had, which makes me feel like maybe I am important, but not really. Right now in Panama City, near the Panama Canal, the temperature is 86 high. And I wish we could bring some of that tropical climate here, but it is what it is. I also wanted to tell you an anecdote that actually happened yesterday. I went to the barber shop and I told my barber, I want to have a haircut that makes me look like David McCullough. And he said, who is David McCullough? We usually talk about fishing, baseball, a little politics, but I don't think he reads many books. So I said, well, David McCullough is a famous author with a magnificent crop of white hair that makes him look so dignified. And he has written the best book that I know of about the construction of the Panama Canal. And also, he has given the best talk I have ever heard about the Panama Canal. So he looked at me for a moment and said, you know, Doc, we have two problems here. You don't have enough hair, and you don't look like a famous author. So let's start with the talk. When I suggested the title, which included the word miasmas or miasmas, Eric Ward, who helps everybody organize the talks here, said it's not a good word. Most people really don't know what it means. But I think it is important to at least mention the word miasmas, because the concept that diseases were caused by bad air or bad water or inimical environments were thought to be the reason that people got sick. And particularly with epidemics like yellow fever or cholera, these were blamed on miasmas. And although the term is relatively recent, because actually it wasn't coined less than 100 years ago, the idea had been there for thousands of years. Even Hippocrates, 400 before Christ, talked about bad airs causing disease. So my definition is rather lengthy, but is putrid, foul-smelling vapors emanating from swamps and low wetlands due to decomposition of organic matter such as filth and trash and vegetable material thought to cause diseases. The word malaria, which has been around for about 1,000 years, actually means in Latin, bad air. So the only remedies known at the time and until the last century were fresh air and cleanliness. This is a cartoon by one of the great political cartoonists in New York, Joseph Kepler, and it shows death waiting. And you can maybe read down here the words Panama, because Panama was known as a pesthole, and whoever went there risked dying of yellow fever, malaria, or some strange tropical disease. So it had a terrible, terrible reputation as a pesthole. In 1881, the French began their effort to construct an interoceanic canal on the Isthmus of Panama. And the job was directed by Ferdinand de Lesseps, who had been a hero in France because he had constructed the Suez Canal. And so he said, building a sea-level canal in Panama will be much easier than constructing the Suez Canal. The excavations began in 1881, and by 1881, and by 1889, at a cost of $279 million and 22,000 deaths, the French decided that that was enough and pulled out and left in disgrace. The reason for the French failure in Panama was blamed on poor administration and tropical diseases, mainly yellow fever and malaria, and there was no way that they knew how to control these diseases. Yellow fever was a dreaded disease. It was called also the yellow scourge, the yellow jack. The person that contracted yellow fever would start with headache, back pain, leg pains, fever, and started to turn yellow as the virus destroyed the liver, and that gave the name of the disease yellow fever. Now, the virus that causes yellow fever, this flavivirus, is merciless, and the mortality is very high, up to 50%. But if you survive, you're immune for life. And this is a great difference between yellow fever and malaria. The death was terrible, swift. The person died in delirium, bleeding inside the organs in the body, and vomiting blood, which gave the disease the name in Spanish known as vómito negro, or black vomit. Now, the big breakthrough occurred in Havana. In 1881, a Cuban physician by the name of Carlos Finlay, shown here in this illustration by Robert Thom, presented a paper to the Academy of Sciences in Havana, Cuba, saying that he was absolutely sure that the cause of yellow fever was transmitted by the mosquito. Not only that, but he singled out a specific type of mosquito. And for years, he tried to prove his theory, but he was never able to prove it because he didn't know one important fact, and that is that it takes the virus about 10 days to incubate in the mosquito before it can be transmitted to another innocent victim. So he was ridiculed, and he was called the Mosquito Man. But he didn't care, and he continued experimenting and trying to prove his theory. During the Spanish-American War, more soldiers died of tropical diseases, especially typhoid and yellow fever, than from battle wounds. And so Surgeon General Sternberg, who was a leading bacteriologist, appointed a commission to study the cause of these diseases and how they could treat them. So he named a commission headed by Walter Reed, shown here, looking at the thermometer. And part of the commission were 3 other persons, of which 2 are shown here, that helped him investigate the cause of yellow fever. They started by trying to culture bacteria from the tissues of victims who have died of yellow fever, but after several months, the results were 0. They were fruitless. They were unable to find any specific bacteria that caused yellow fever. And so they decided that they had to take a different approach. And they had heard about Carlos Finlay and his theory, and so on a very fortunate day, August 1st, 1900, they paid Finlay a visit in his home and asked him to explain all the details of his theory. Finlay was very pleased to know that someone was interested in his crazy theory. And so he gave the commission members all the notebooks that he had written, all the more than 100 experiments he had made inoculating human volunteers. And the most important thing that he did, he gave them a porcelain dish that contained eggs of the mosquito that caused yellow fever. This was a gift that was priceless because it facilitated the work of the commission, and within a few months, they used the mosquitoes that came in that porcelain dish, and they were able to create yellow fever in volunteers by using mosquitoes loaded with the yellow fever virus. And so they proved what Finlay had been trying to convince people for 20 years, that yellow fever was transmitted by the mosquito. This is a drawing of the yellow fever mosquito. It is a very strange mosquito, a beautiful mosquito, Gorgas said, and it likes to be near where humans live. It loves to breed in water receptacles and containers that were used to collect rainwater for drinking, and she would like to always be close to humans, where she would look for a meal of blood. Gorgas was in charge of sanitation of Havana, Cuba, at the time that Reed and Finlay were working on the mosquito hypothesis. At the beginning, he didn't believe what Finlay was trying to say about the transmission of yellow fever by mosquitoes, and he concentrated on just cleaning Havana. He went over every house. This was a city of 200,000 people, and cleaning every street and removing every receptacle where there might be mosquito eggs was an arduous task, but he was able to do it. But despite cleaning Havana, yellow fever continued to kill and decimate the population of Cuba. Sometimes as much as a third of the population would die victims of yellow fever. So when Reed proved that the mosquito transmitted yellow fever, he then changed his approach and began to exterminate mosquitoes by fumigation and killing them in any way that they could. And within 6 months, he eliminated yellow fever for the first time in Cuba in hundreds of years. This was a medical miracle. This had never happened before. A place well known for being a terrible death site for people that could acquire yellow fever, such a terrible disease, suddenly was free of yellow fever. And so all the people involved, including Gorgas, were cheered as medical heroes and became famous. Gorgas finished his work in Cuba in 1902, and then he requested to be sent to Panama to do the same work, because he was convinced that the Americans, the only way they could complete constructing the Panama Canal was by sanitation of the area and removing the mosquitoes that cause yellow fever. So he was assigned to be the sanitary officer in Panama in 1902, but he had to wait until Congress approved the formation of the Isthmian Canal Commission, which was made of 7 members, and he waited for a couple of years until he could start the work. What he didn't realize was that it wasn't the mosquito that was going to be the great enemy. It was the members of the Isthmian Canal Commission, none of whom believed that the mosquito had anything to do with yellow fever. And so when he started requesting materials and supplies to implement his sanitation program, they said, no, you're asking for too much. We can't spend that much money in insecticide powder. And so every request that he put to the commission was either denied or shelved. Gorgas, fortunately, was a very patient man. McCullough calls him the imperturbable Dr. Gorgas. His wife, Marie, said that the most important qualities he had were this infinite patience and perseverance. He never gave up. However, his secretary said that he would become so frustrated that some days he would stomp into the office, throw all the papers into the floor, and walked out and disappear for a couple of days until he cooled down and came back and continued his job. He was able to sanitate Panama after 2 years. By 1906, what he called the halcyon years, he had cleaned Panama of yellow fever. He eliminated yellow fever in 8 months, a couple of months later than what took him to eliminate yellow fever in Cuba. However, the real enemy, as he had predicted, was not yellow fever. It was malaria. Malaria, in contrast to yellow fever, didn't kill the patients. Malaria made them sick for 2 weeks. In 1906, 821 of each 1,000 workers were disabled with malaria. So the excavation almost stopped because 80% of the workforce were sick in the hospital with malaria. They recovered, but they were not immune. They could be bitten again by the mosquito, and they would have another bout of malaria. So each year, maybe they would have 3 or 4 bouts of malaria. And it was very difficult to control malaria. This is a very nice photographic arrangement of Gorgas, who conducted his activities of sanitation at Ancon Hospital. These buildings were part of the hospital that was left by the French after they abandoned Panama, their project of the canal in Panama. The buildings were located on either side of a winding road that went up a hill called Ancon Hill, and it stretched over a mile with about 39 or 40 buildings, all of which were constructed with that idea that fresh air, good ventilation were important to keep the miasmas away. This is a colored postcard, hand-colored postcard, showing some of the buildings reaching at the top of the hill some 200 feet above sea level. The buildings had tall windows and open verandas to allow the fresh breezes that came from the ocean to ventilate and keep the bad air out and the good air in. But unfortunately, the hospital was a mosquito paradise. The Sisters of Charity, who took care of the patients, loved to plant ornamental flowers and shrubs around the hospital, and to keep the ants away, they put these ceramic rings around each plant and filled them with water to keep the ants from devouring the shrubs and flowers and bushes. And every one of these was an incubator for mosquitoes. So when Gorgas found that out, he raised all of the shrubs and plants. He said it looked like a feat of vandalism, but that was the only way that he could really fight the mosquito, by eliminating every little pot of water where mosquitoes would breed and reproduce other mosquitoes. This is another postcard showing the French cemetery with some of the tombstones of the victims of yellow fever and malaria during the French effort to construct the canal. This building at the hospital, called the St. Charles Ward, was reputedly the building where more individuals had died of yellow fever than any other building in the world. It is calculated that at least 1,200 patients died of yellow fever in this building. In order to keep the mosquitoes away, there was a vestibule that was screened, and there was always a person there making sure that whoever entered would shut the door and that not a single mosquito could get in. When you had a patient with yellow fever, there was also an enclosure that was screened to keep mosquitoes in case one mosquito ever got in, to keep from biting the patient and spreading the disease. Gorgas was always proud to say that throughout the years that he was there sanitating Panama, that there was never a case of yellow fever among the hundreds of doctors and nurses that work with yellow fever patients. And that is a testimony to how conscientious they were about keeping the mosquitoes away. So, as we said, Gorgas knew that yellow fever could be conquered, but malaria was the real problem. So, as I said, in 1906, more than 80% of the force was down with malaria. From January 1905 to September 1905, 83,000 hospital admissions, half of them were due to malaria. And most cases were caused by the specific malaria species called falciparum. Between 1904 and 1918, about 15 years, over 100 cases of malaria were recorded and 948 deaths. This was about less than 1% mortality compared to the high mortality of yellow fever, which ranged from 10 to 50%. The life cycle of malaria is very complex, and I think even if we had time, I would have trouble explaining all the parts of it. Only to tell you that there's an extrinsic incubation period in the mosquito, which is called the sexual phase, and then after the mosquito bites a victim, then it reproduces within in the organs, especially the liver, and causes the fever and the chills that are so characteristic of malaria. Now let's talk a little bit about mosquitoes. The mosquitoes are a supreme example of simplicity and efficiency. They have been around for about 150 million years. So they're way ahead of us in adapting and doing what they're supposed to do. In this electron scanning microscope photomicrograph from National Geographic, we see some of the important and interesting structures. We have two eyes. The mosquitoes have about 150 eyes. They cannot tell a lot of detail, but they can see light and shadow, and they can certainly spot somebody who's trying to get rid of them, and can fly very quickly away to a safe place by beating their wings 100 to 600 times a second. Now, the most interesting part of the mosquito, or several of them, for example, the proboscis is like a needle, very sharp at the end. She, and only the female, needs blood as a meal in order to develop the eggs, introduces the proboscis under the skin, and then secretes through the salivary glands a protein that is an anticoagulant that keeps the blood from clotting and sucks the blood that it needs in order to keep the development of the eggs. The other thing that is very interesting is that the antenna, the two antennas, have sensors that detect heat. They detect carbon dioxide from expired air from vertebrates, including humans, and they can detect sweat. So that's how they zone in on the victims. And they, as I said, have a very efficient eye system. They can look about 270 degrees around, whereas we can only spot about 180 degrees. So they have vision that can detect anything that moves almost completely around the head of the mosquito. The lifespan of the mosquito is very short, about 3 weeks, and it takes about 2 weeks to develop the eggs. So the female has to find a blood meal very quickly because it will live only about a week later after the eggs are completely developed. And so some of the mosquitoes can fly up to 300 feet using wind currents, and they have been found to be vectors of other diseases such as dengue, elephantiasis, West Nile fever, and chikungunya fever. Now, time for a quiz. What do the scarecrow, the tin man, and mosquitoes have in common? The answer: mosquitoes don't have a brain or a heart. Now, how is that? Well, they don't have a brain, but they have a set of nerve cells collected in ganglions, or small groups of cells located here and shown in green. And each one has a specific function to respond, like to the vision or the compound eyes, also to the proboscis, which is where the blood is sucked into the body of the mosquito. They don't have a heart, but they have a vein which carries endolymph. And this is in charge of taking out the carbon dioxide that is produced from oxidation in the cells and providing oxygen. So they don't have a heart, but they have a lymphatic system that acts like a circulatory system. In order to combat malaria, Gorgas divided the canal zone, which was a large area of about 500 square miles, into 24 or 25 districts, each one composed of 10 to 100 men and directed by an inspector. They were in charge of fumigating or insecticide, and also of digging ditches so that they could drain all the stagnant water that was available where mosquitoes could breed. The amount of manpower and supplies that were used by Gorgas were exorbitant. In the first year, he requested and used 120 tons of insecticide, which was all the supply that was available in the United States for that year, as well as 300 tons of sulfur in order to kill mosquitoes. So the sanitation program consisted of many different steps, all of which were important. They were supposed to cut the brush at least 100 feet around every building and house in the canal zone, because that's where the mosquito was supposed to be. They poured oil and kerosene on any stagnant water that was around the buildings in the canal zone, such as streams and pools of water from the rain. They had a larvicide that they could put in the water to kill the larvae of the mosquitoes. And even they paid workers 1 cent for each mosquito that they could catch. And that was very productive. They killed hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes every year that way. They also screened the buildings, isolated the patients, and 40,000 doses of quinine were administered every month to keep malaria from making the patients sicker than they should be. Another idea of the amount of work that was done, it was very important to dig ditches. And between 1904 to 1914, during the construction of a canal, 6 million feet of open ditches, 1.5 million feet of concrete-lined ditches, and 1 million feet of subsoil tile ditches were built. If you take all these million feet, it adds to about 160 miles, or at least 30 times the length of the canal itself, which was called the Big Ditch. But these small ditches were very, very important because it kept the breeding sites that were selected by the mosquitoes from propagating malaria. So using these techniques, the incidence of malaria gradually dropped from the 821 per thousand to half in the first year, and then gradually reducing until it was so low that nobody had to worry too much about malaria interfering with the excavation of the canal. Now these two cartoons, some of you may be old enough to remember the ad that said, "Quick, Henry, get the flit." What you may not know is that these cartoons were drawn by Dr. Seuss before he started his vocation, real vocation of drawing storybooks for children. One of the other cartoons favorite of mine from the far side is this mosquito. The other one is telling, "Pull out, Betty, pull out. You've hit an artery." Here is a list of the causes of death in Panama. And this is from a review of all the autopsy studies that were done on the 5,000 to 6,000 deaths that occurred during the American construction of the canal. And the interesting thing about these statistics is that the two leading causes of death were respiratory. Pneumonia and tuberculosis were the leading causes of death. So Gorgas appointed a team to look into why this was so. And it was found that most of the deaths occurred among the West Indian laborers who were housed in small rooms with 20 or 30 of them, with very little ventilation and stifling heat. And it was so easy then to transmit the germs of pneumonia from one to the other. The same thing held true for tuberculosis. Despite the findings that showed that crowded housing and poor ventilation were the main factors for the cause of pneumonia and tuberculosis among the workers, very little was done to remedy that. The third cause of death was trauma, of which we will talk more, and most of the deaths of malaria occurred in the first 2 years, after which the malaria number of deaths declined significantly. Gorgas believed that the poor standard of living of the workers was to blame for the high incidence of pneumonia. And so he said that if he were allowed to select only one sanitary measure, he would select doubling their wages. Because by doubling their wages, they could get better nutrition, better housing, and improve the living conditions. But the canal zone was a place where concern about the safety of the workers and the living conditions was not an important issue. There was discrimination in the canal zone against people that were not white, and so things were allowed to continue as they were. The third cause of death in the Panama sanitation, during the Panama construction, was what they call external violence. There was heavy machinery, there were accidents, and so many died from injuries related to slides, mining accidents where dynamite detonated prematurely. The dynamite was carried by the workers, and drills were used to make holes, and then the sticks of dynamite were pushed down the holes with a metal stick, and frequently detonated prematurely, killing the workers. So it was a very dangerous activity to work for the construction of the canal. There were some figures that were available about the number of cases of trauma. The surgeons had numbers that indicated that between 1910 and 1912, of 7,000 surgical cases that they saw, about half or more than 10,000 were from trauma. Of these were 4,639 from mining accidents, lacerations over 1,000, railroad accidents 804, falls, sprains, and amputations. The workers were mainly from the West Indies. They came looking for a better opportunity to earn better wages. They were promised free health care, and they thought it was a better opportunity that they had back home working on the sugar plantations. This is one of the ships that brought about 1,200 workers. But as I said, discrimination versus non-white workers was rampant in the canal zone. They were paid half the wages for similar work that white workers were paid. And so they were divided into gold roll for the white workers and silver roll because they were paid in silver Colombian pesos, which were worth only half of the US golden dollar. So as already was mentioned, there was more death and sickness due to poor housing and also deficient nutrition. This is one of the segregated wards at Ancon Hospital. It housed 24 patients. And I must say that despite the discrimination, all of the workers received excellent medical care. The doctors and nurses had no problem taking care of black patients, white patients, patients from Italy, from Spain, from China, wherever they came. And so the medical care was excellent. So here's a load of coffins. This is from a picture postcard by one of the Panama premier collectors from South Carolina, showing coffins, wooden coffins waiting at the train station to be used for all the victims that died during the construction of the canal. And here's another picture postcard showing one of the cemeteries in the same hill that the hospital was, where the victims were buried. So that's the story of the sanitation of Panama. Here's a picture 100 years before, showing the Bay of Panama, part of Panama City. And here's Panama City today, a thriving metropolis of about 1.3 million people, dozens of high-rise buildings. It looks like Miami, Florida, actually. There's about 120 banks. It's a commercial center for much of Latin America. And in a recent survey, of all the countries in the world, Panama was #1 as having the happiest people. Now, I don't know if they were happy because they drink too much or dance too much or eat too much, but they were very happy about the living conditions, the per capita income, which is about $12,000 a year, which is pretty good for that area. They're very happy with the health care, which is very inexpensive, and many of the doctors there have trained and are boarded in the United States. So Panama is different from the other countries around Central America and South America. And I have thought about this a long time. And I think it is the American influence, that spirit that David McCullough, who has better hair than I do, that made the Panamanian people learn how to do things. In Costa Rica, where I come from, to do anything, you have to go 3 offices and spend half the day talking to people and filling out papers. Not in Panama. They're efficient. They learn from the Americans. And I think this is the best legacy that we have from the Americans that built the Panama Canal. I want to take this opportunity and thank President Lisa Bower, Eric Ward, Bruce Bradley, and especially Angela Tangen, who have made us feel so special and almost as part of the family of the Linda Hall Library. I know of no other place in the world, not even Panama, where the centennial of the Panama Canal opening has been celebrated in such a tremendously satisfying way, with the beautiful exhibit, with the memorable night of dancing, singing, and drinking that was Moon Over Panama, and with great speakers, including David McCullough, and of course myself.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and we have time for some questions. Raise your hand, and I'll come by with a microphone. We want to get the audio on our videotape, and we also have a live stream audience. So the online audience will be able to hear the questions as well. We'll start up front.
Yeah, you said that there were people who were willing to volunteer to be, I guess, bitten by the mosquito. Why would someone volunteer for that, to do that? I'm sure
They
that was an idea
volunteered
for everybody.
because, number one, they were soldiers, and they did what they were told to do. But also, in Cuba, they were paid $100 just to volunteer. And if they got yellow fever and didn't die, they were paid another $100. So that was the incentive.
Okay, I'll be right over there. You know what Navy stands for? Never again volunteer yourself.
I got two questions pertaining to the yellow fever. First of all, is it a disease from the old world or from Africa brought to the Americas? And could there have been a resistance built up because of that? And the other one, you said yellow fever was erased in Panama, but malaria was not. If they're both transmitted by mosquitoes, how is that possible?
All right. One of Gorgas' members of his team, a sanitation team, was Henry Carter. And he had studied the history of yellow fever and wrote a book about the history of yellow fever. And he concluded that it came from Africa. And most people agree with that. And it was brought over on the ships that brought the slaves from Africa and then took a stronghold in the Americas. The reason that malaria was completely eradicated is because the yellow fever mosquito is easy to destroy. It lives near the homes, as I said. It prefers to deposit the eggs in receptacles that were used at the time to collect rainwater for drinking. And so it was easy. The other reason is that you develop an immunity to yellow fever. So if you have it and you don't die, you're immune for life. And this is because it's a virus infection. Now, malaria is smarter. It doesn't kill you, but it makes you sick. And you don't develop immunity to it. So you can get it again and again and again. For example, attempts to develop a vaccine against malaria have never been successful, and I doubt they ever will be. The idea that you can get immunity to malaria is not really true. The statistics that we have from Panama is that the black laborers, presumably with African genes, were just as likely to get malaria as the white people. So there was not really that resistance because of race.
But malaria, the tropica, the malaria tropica, that's the one I got, for example. You don't get immune, but you don't have occurring outbreaks like you have with the tertiana and the quartiana. So it's kind of a semi-immunity.
Well, it is possible. I don't know of any specific studies that show that you develop antibodies to the plasmodia. I don't know that there are such...
You don't have any more outbreaks, that's what it's...
Outbreaks. No, I think that malaria becomes endemic in most of the regions of the world. And the other thing is that the mosquito in almost every different part of the world is a different mosquito, so that the efforts to eradicate the mosquito that are effective in one place may not be effective in another. So I don't think I have answered your question, but I really don't know the answer why you don't get it again and again. Yeah, because the falciparum malaria in Panama, at least, they got it again and again and again. And it's the most severe form of malaria.
You're in the middle of the room, Dr. Chaves?
The yellow fever vaccine that I received 40 years ago, is it still protective?
I don't know how long it protects. I think that somebody may know 10 years is about right, and maybe you're protected even longer, but for safety reasons, they recommend when you go to a place like Africa where there's still some yellow fever that you better vaccinate again after 10 years.
Right in the back of the room.
Were there any human repercussions from the fumigation process?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear well.
Were there any health issues that came from the fumigation process that eradicated the mosquitoes?
When I was a boy, I remember waking up with flea bites, and mosquitoes were everywhere, and insects were a real pain. And when DDT came, everybody was so happy. But we didn't know what it did to the environment until Rachel Carson published her book. And I think we lived in Panama for 4 years, and the fumigation truck came every day in the late afternoon, and the kids would run behind the truck, you know, breathing the insecticide, and nobody worried about it. Now, I'm sure that if they checked certain blood components, maybe it lowered the hemoglobin or the platelets, but nobody knew that it was harmful in those days, at least during the construction of the canal.
Up front here, Dr. Chaves.
I noticed the cemetery on Encon Hill. Now, I hope I'm not going to insult anybody here. A cemetery is not a bunch of latrines, but still there were people buried there with disease. Now come the rains and wash down the what? Anything?
I'm not sure about the answer to that. Panama is a land of torrential rains. And so it is very probable that the decomposition of the bodies, some of the organic material got mixed even with the potable water that was drunk by the people. But I think there were some studies, for example, that showed that if you buried a person who died of yellow fever and you went back and tried to grow the virus, that it was no longer there. So I don't think that at least the yellow fever virus could survive dead tissues once the person died for too long. How long, I don't know. But there were complaints that at times the coffins would float up and be found, the skeletons scattered, because it's a hill. And the cemeteries were not well taken care of, especially the French cemetery, for many, many years. But I don't think the public health authorities were concerned about what you're referring to. Yes.
Is there anything that we can learn from this that would impact the effects of Ebola in Africa today?
I think one of the important things that we have learned about diseases is that a disease is not the virus, the bacteria, or the parasite. A disease is also the environment and the people in that environment. And so you cannot control a disease until you're able to educate the governments and the people of the scientific facts. And in Africa, there's still miasmatic ideas that people have. They don't believe that the doctors, actually they blame some of the doctors and nurses that they thought were bringing Ebola and killed some of them. So against ignorance and lack of scientific facts and unwillingness by the governments to combat Ebola is going to be a tough nut to crack.
Right, thank you, Dr. Chaves, for the wonderful lecture. And thank you for attending tonight's event. It's great to see a big crowd at our final Panama Canal lecture. Check the website, lindahall.org. Lisa mentioned our mixed bag of programs for next year. I've got a couple of the lectures posted already. So things like, Moneyball, Mount Everest, the Titanic, geometric puzzles, that'll give you an idea
Sorry.
of what to look forward to.
See here.
Thank you and good night.